What if I told you that the very people who complain about your ambition, question your boundaries, or criticize your growth are the ones who were never meant to stay in your life? Every time you raise your standards, the wrong people leave, but the right ones, the ones who will truly elevate you, show up. Today, I'm going to show you why your standards aren't a barrier, they're the ultimate filter, and why the moment you embrace them, your life starts attracting the people and opportunities you actually deserve. Your standards are not barriers meant to keep people out, but filters meant to protect what you are building. And when you finally understand that, you stop apologizing for wanting more than bare minimum energy in your life, and they help you separate the people who value depth from those who only want convenience. Because anyone who is threatened by your expectations is someone who benefited from you having none, and you start noticing how the wrong people fade when they realize you no longer bend for their comfort. And the right ones stay because they operate at the same level of intention, and you discover that the moment you choose alignment over approval, the noise around you gets quieter, and your focus becomes razor sharp, and you see that standards are clarity tools, exposing who is truly invested and who is only pretending to care as long as it serves them. And you learn that it is not your job to lower your expectations so others can feel comfortable staying in the same place they've been for years, and you accept that not everyone will understand the discipline, sacrifices, and non-negotiables that matter to you. And that's exactly why they're not meant to walk every part of the journey with you. And you realize that the people who can handle your standards are not intimidated by them, because they've built their own and recognize the strength it takes. And you begin to feel the difference between someone who respects your boundaries and someone who feels restricted by them. And that difference is everything. And you learn that the fastest way to align your relationships with your goals is to stop apologizing for requiring the same effort you give, and raising your standards forces you to confront where you've been settling. And that truth alone can be uncomfortable, but it's necessary if you want real growth, and it shows you how often you exchanged your peace for acceptance, your time for validation, and your values for temporary company. And it exposes the cost of staying small, and you start reclaiming parts of yourself you abandoned trying to be liked. And you stop trying to convince people to treat you the way you should have demanded from the start, and you notice how different life becomes when you decide that your energy is too valuable to waste on people who refuse to grow or meet you halfway. You understand that anyone who views your clarity as pressure is revealing their lack of to show up consistently, and you start recognizing that the wrong people thrive in environments where your boundaries are unclear, your vision is dim, and your standards are negotiable, and you commit to choosing discomfort over resentment, knowing that lowering your expectations always leads to long-term regret. And you learn to stop explaining why you want better, because anyone who needs you to justify growth is someone who doesn't plan on growing with you. And you feel the shift in how people approach you when they realize you're no longer willing to compromise your identity for temporary relationships. You witness firsthand that standards don't push people away. They simply reveal who shouldn't have been there in the first place, and standards teach you to value your time differently. Because when you understand the weight of your purpose, you stop entertaining anything that doesn't support it, and they push you to elevate your habits, behaviors, and environment to match the person you're becoming, not the version you've outgrown. And you begin to see that having high standards isn't about perfection, but about protecting the direction your life is heading. And you stop giving chances to people who show you repeatedly that they don't value them, and start giving access only to those who earn it through action. And you learn that consistency matters more than potential, and that the people who truly belong in your life are the ones who show up, not just speak. And you become aware that your standards are mirrors reflecting your beliefs about your own worth, which is why raising them requires deep internal work. And you discover that the wrong people call your standards too much because they expect you to settle for less than you deserve. And you see that the right people will never be pushed away by your discipline, your vision, or your boundaries, because they live by their own. And you realize that standards simplify your life by eliminating confusion, emotional chaos, and relationships built on convenience rather than authenticity. And you understand that protecting your path is not selfish, but essential, because no one can walk your journey for you. And the more you honor your standards, the more you attract people who operate with intention, clarity, and self-respect. And you start witnessing how your environment shifts when you stop tolerating half-effort energy, because your presence no longer offers space for inconsistency, and you gain a sense of inner strength from knowing you built a life that matches your values instead of defaulting to what others wanted from you. And you begin to appreciate the quiet confidence that comes from living aligned instead of trying to earn validation through lowering your expectations. And you understand that the wrong people were never scared of your standards. They were scared of losing the version of you that made life easy for them, and you recognize that high standards don't limit your relationships. They elevate them by creating room only for people who match your pace, and you start valuing quality over quantity, realizing that a handful of aligned people are more powerful than a crowd of inconsistent ones, and you embrace the truth that any life built without standards will eventually collapse under the weight of its own compromises, and you feel anchored by the stability that comes from knowing what you accept, what you won't, and what you're striving toward. And you learn, above all, that the people meant for you will rise to meet your standards, not run from them. When you start raising your standards, you quickly realize that the people who become offended were never invested in your growth, only in your convenience. And that truth hits hard when you finally see it clearly, and they weren't intimidated by your confidence, discipline, or ambition. They were intimidated by losing access to the version of you that made life comfortable for them. And they liked you better when you were easier to influence, easier to guilt, and easier to rely on for emotional support you never received back. And your lower standards made room for people who needed your energy more than they respected it. And when you stop offering yourself that freely, their reaction exposes their intentions, and you find that the moment you begin showing up for yourself, the people who benefited from your absence suddenly feel betrayed, not because you wronged them, but because you stopped allowing them to drain you. And their discomfort is not about who you are becoming, but about who they can no longer be around you, because elevation demands accountability they never planned to provide. And you discover that the more you grow, the more some people try to shrink you, because your progress reminds them of their own stagnation, and their criticism becomes a reflection of their internal battles, not your external actions, showing you who was supportive only when you stayed on their level. And you see that your growth is not the threat. They fear what your growth reveals about their lack of effort. And then once you recognize this, their reactions stop feeling personal and start feeling predictable, and people get scared of your standards because they can no longer manipulate the soft spots you used to ignore. And they can no longer hide behind the excuses you used to accept, and they can't rely on your silence to tolerate their inconsistency, because you've outgrown the version of yourself that allowed chaos to feel normal. And they get uncomfortable because they realize their usual shortcuts, lies, and minimal effort no longer earn the access they once enjoyed. And you begin to notice who only showed up when it was beneficial for them, and how quickly they pull away when you no longer bend to their convenience. And your boundaries become a mirror that forces them to confront their lack of integrity. And instead of growing, many choose to avoid looking at the reflection, and you see clearly that some relationships weren't relationships at all, just arrangements built on your willingness to self-abandon. And as your standards rise, those arrangements collapse, revealing how fragile they were without your constant sacrifice holding them together. And the moment you start choosing peace over people pleasing, your life changes in ways you didn't know were possible. And you learn that you don't lose people. You lose the versions of them that benefited from a version of you that no longer exists. And then with that shift, you finally understand that outgrowing people isn't cruel. It's necessary, and raising your standards makes you rethink every place you allowed yourself to stay small just to keep the peace. And it forces you to confront how often you accepted less than you deserved. And you look back at moments where you laughed off disrespect, overextended your kindness, and tolerated inconsistency because you were afraid of being alone. And you recognize how deeply you were conditioned to prioritize harmony over honesty, even when that harmony demanded your silence. And your growth teaches you that you don't have to betray yourself to be loved, and anyone who required you to do so was never offering real love in the first place. And you begin to redefine what respect, loyalty, presence, and effort actually mean, stripping away the illusions that once kept you stuck. And you start noticing your own patterns, how you overgave, how you ignored red flags, and how you confused potential with proof. And as you evolve, you become aware that your standards were not too high, your tolerance was too low, and you realize that the people who called you too much were simply asking to be less than who you were meant to be. And their fear wasn't of losing you, it was of losing the comfort they felt when you undervalued yourself. And then by choosing growth, you break the cycle that kept you settling for versions of relationships that were never meant for you, and you grow into someone who no longer explains, defends, or justifies why you expect effort, honesty, and consistency, because you finally understand that these are basics, not burdens. And you stop trying to convince people to match your energy, because you realize that if someone wanted to meet your standard, they already would have. And you start valuing alignment over attachment, recognizing that chemistry without commitment is chaos, and connection without consistency is confusion. And the people who used to take advantage of your kindness now call you changed, not because you became harsh, but because you stopped letting them benefit from your softness, and you learn that the right people will adjust to your standards naturally, while the wrong people will try to talk you out of them, and you stop giving unlimited access to people who offer limited effort. And it becomes easier to detach from anything that doesn't honor your growth. And as your standards solidify, you're no longer impressed by words, promises, or charm. You measure people by their patterns, not their potential, and you realize the wrong people were never scared of your standards. They were scared you'd finally see your worth and stop accepting their excuses, and you understand that your growth threatens anyone who relied on your old patterns. But that's not a sign to shrink. It's a sign to keep expanding, and then you discover a new level of peace that comes from living a life aligned with who you're becoming, not who you were forced to be. And the more you evolve, the clearer it becomes that your standards don't push people away. They simply reveal who isn't willing to rise, and your growth requires you to leave behind old dynamics, old patterns, and old versions of yourself that kept you tied to people who were never meant to stay. And you begin to attract individuals who see your standards not as demands, but as reflections of your self-respect and direction. And people who are meant for you don't get scared. They get inspired because they recognize in you the very qualities they are cultivating within themselves. And those who walk away are simply choosing the comfort of stagnation over the discomfort of growth. And that has nothing to do with your worth. And as you continue on this path, your life becomes clearer, your relationships become healthier, and your energy becomes protected in ways you once thought were impossible. And you stop chasing acceptance and start attracting alignment. And the difference between the two becomes the foundation of your peace. And you learn to trust yourself more deeply. Because every time someone leaves due to your standards, it proves you're no longer available for the version of life that kept you small, and you master the art of letting go without resentment, because you finally understand that release is not loss. It is space, and in that space, you make room for people who don't fear your standards because they carry their own. Your standards are not arbitrary rules. They are a declaration of how much you value yourself, and the moment you internalize that, everything in your life begins to shift, and they are the blueprint for the life you want. A reflection of the discipline, focus, and self-respect you demand from yourself first before expecting it from anyone else. And high standards are uncomfortable because they require consistency, sacrifice, and accountability. And they expose how much of your past life was built on compromise. And you realize that people who have no respect for themselves will always resist those who have learned to demand it. Because self-respect makes weakness obvious, and your standards are a mirror showing both your growth and everyone else's gaps. And some people cannot handle seeing what they have refused to cultivate. And you notice that when you begin to enforce these standards, many of the relationships you relied on begin to fracture, revealing who was really invested. And you start to understand that having standards doesn't make you elitist. It makes you intentional, and intention is powerful, not negotiable. And people who don't align with your expectations don't belong in your life, not because they're bad, but because they are incompatible with the version of you you are becoming. And your standards protect your energy, your vision, and your integrity, ensuring that the effort you give is matched by the people you allow into your space. And then as this understanding deepens, you begin to see that high standards are not a limitation. They are a magnet for alignment and growth, and rising your standards forces you to confront every place you have tolerated mediocrity. Every moment you have given too much to people who wouldn't meet you halfway, and it shines a light on the patterns that have held you back, showing you how often comfort disguised itself as loyalty, and how often convenience disguised itself as love. And you begin to analyze where you have been inconsistent with yourself, and the truth hurts. But it also fuels transformation, because awareness is the first step to mastery, and you start demanding accountability, not from others alone, but from yourself. Recognizing that the foundation of high standards is self-discipline. And as you honor your own boundaries, you begin to recognize when others fail to honor them. And you stop rationalizing behavior that once would have broken your peace. And your standards make your expectations clear, but they also make your self-worth undeniable, because you are no longer willing to dilute your value for anyone. And you see that the right people don't see standards as rules. They see them as a reflection of integrity, ambition, and consistency that they respect and want to match. And you stop fearing rejection, because rejection from the wrong people is not loss. It is confirmation that your boundaries are working, and the right relationships grow stronger, deeper, and more aligned, while the wrong ones dissolve quietly, leaving you with clarity and energy. And then you start to experience the rare freedom that comes from living by your own rules, not the expectations of others. And high standards are a signal to the world about the level of respect you demand and the kind of life you refuse to compromise. And they communicate without words that you will not settle for less than what you deserve. whether in work love or personal growth, and you learn that people who balk at your standards were comfortable benefiting from your previous tolerance, and their resistance is not about you, it's about their inability to rise. And you start to see that boundaries are not just defensive, they are proactive tools for shaping the people and experiences that belong in your life. And your standards become a guide for decision making, helping you quickly identify who is worth your time and who is not, and reducing wasted energy. And you recognize that many relationships are transactional. And enforcing standards is the way to ensure the exchange is mutual, not one-sided. And you embrace the fact that integrity requires courage, because the higher your standards, the more uncomfortable it becomes for those unwilling to meet them. And you learn to stay consistent even when it feels easier to compromise, knowing that each concession chips away at the life you are building, and your life becomes cleaner, more focused, and more intentional, because you no longer allow people or circumstances to dictate your energy. And in this process, you begin to feel the empowerment that comes from owning your worth unapologetically. And when your standards are clear, you attract individuals who are committed, ambitious, and aligned with the same level of intention, and they do not fear your expectations. They recognize them as a reflection of the discipline they respect and aspire to embody themselves, and you begin to see that compatibility is not a matter of chance. It is the alignment of values, effort, and respect that your standards create naturally, and your standards weed out distractions, half-hearted attempts, and energy vampires, leaving room for growth, creativity, and meaningful connections. And you learn that demanding respect and consistency is not arrogance. It is necessary for preserving your momentum and vision. And as your self-respect rises, so does your tolerance for laziness, excuses, and inconsistency drop. And you become more selective about who earns your time, and the right people show up because they see your standards as non-negotiable. And that clarity creates stronger, healthier, and more productive relationships. And you notice how much lighter your life feels when you no longer negotiate for attention, respect, or effort that should have been given freely. And your standards are not burdens. They are guides that help you focus on what matters, protect your energy, and elevate your life. And then you start to recognize that growth, alignment, and fulfillment are not possible without the courage to enforce the standards you set. And every time you uphold your standards, you strengthen the blueprint of the life you are designing and demonstrate the seriousness of your commitment. And you begin to understand that settling is a form of self-betrayal, and that each compromise weakens not only your life, but your sense of identity. And the wrong people will resist, criticize, or leave, but their reactions are evidence that you are no longer available for mediocrity or toxicity. And you learn to separate emotional attachment from alignment, recognizing that presence without effort is a liability, not a connection. And your standards teach you patience, because building a life of value requires waiting for people and opportunities that are worthy of your energy. And you start to honor yourself more than approval, knowing that self-respect is the ultimate currency that drives fulfillment and success. And the right relationships amplify your energy, challenge you to grow, and match your ambition. And that clarity comes only through high standards. And you notice how much easier decision-making becomes when your expectations are explicit, reducing friction and unnecessary compromise. And high standards cultivate self-awareness, resilience, and an uncompromising sense of identity that cannot be shaken by external opinion. And then you realize that living by these standards transforms your life, relationships, and sense of purpose in ways that comfort never could. And the moment you adopt high standards, you no longer chase validation, you chase growth, alignment, and meaningful impact. And your energy becomes protected, your relationships become intentional, and your life begins to reflect the value you finally place on yourself. And you start to notice how often people flinch when confronted with your expectations, and how often they step up when they recognize the seriousness of your standards. And your standards illuminate the difference between those who are willing to match your effort and those who are content to coast in your previous tolerance. And you begin to experience clarity in every decision, from friendships to career choices, because your non-negotiables guide every step, and the people who belong in your life rise to meet your standards without resentment, while the wrong ones reveal themselves without confrontation. And you embrace the courage to stay consistent even when it feels easier to lower your expectations, knowing that each boundary strengthens your life. And you understand that alignment is not a gift. It is the natural consequence of living with standards and refusing to settle. And high standards teach you patience, discipline, and discernment, and they create space for relationships, opportunities, and experiences that match your ambition. And then through this relentless commitment to yourself, you learn to build a life that is unapologetically aligned with who you truly are. When you raise your standards, the wrong people naturally fall away, and the right ones start to appear in your life, not because you chase them, but because your energy begins to attract alignment. And the right people aren't intimidated by your clarity, your discipline, or your ambition. They are inspired by it, and they see in you the level of commitment they aspire to reach. And these are the people who will celebrate your wins without envy, who will challenge you without hostility, and who will show up consistently because they understand the value of integrity. And you start noticing the difference between relationships that demand you shrink to make others comfortable and those that expand because everyone involved elevates together. And your standards act as a magnet, naturally repelling energy that doesn't belong while creating space for the relationships that enhance your life rather than drain it. And the right people don't resist your growth. They encourage it, they match your energy, and they contribute to your journey rather than distract from it. And you see that connection is not about proximity, but about alignment. And your standards ensure that every person in your circle is intentional, invested, and respectful. And the presence of these aligned people transforms your life, creating momentum that makes growth easier, opportunities clearer, and challenges more manageable. And you realize that high standards don't isolate you. They create your environment, making your life richer, your vision clearer, and your progress inevitable. And then as you embrace this truth, you begin to feel a deep sense of empowerment because the right people enhance your journey instead of holding you back. And the wrong people leave not because you are demanding too much, but because they are unwilling to meet the effort you are willing to give. And their departure is not failure. It is liberation, freeing up space, energy, and time to invest in the people who reflect your values, ambition, and respect. And you stop worrying about being liked by everyone, understanding that the opinions of those who cannot match your standards are irrelevant to your purpose. And instead, you focus on nurturing relationships with those who bring consistency, authenticity, and mutual respect into your life. And the people who align with your standards inspire you to continue raising them because their presence reinforces that your non-negotiables are not obstacles, they are foundations. And you begin to notice that when you enforce your standards, the right people step up without needing to be pushed, proving that alignment is natural when energy matches intention. And your standards act as a filter that reveals who truly belongs in your life. And every person who stays is someone who chooses growth over comfort, effort over excuses. And you feel a profound sense of clarity as the unnecessary drama, half-effort relationships, and misaligned connections fall away, leaving you surrounded by people who truly matter. And your life begins to reflect the power of intentionality because your standards are not arbitrary. They are a reflection of your values, boundaries, and vision. And as the right people flourish around you, you realize that high standards are not a threat. They are the ultimate attractor of quality, energy, and meaningful connection. And the right people are not afraid of your standards. They are energized by them because they mirror the respect, ambition, and discipline they cultivate in themselves. And they see that your boundaries are not walls, but guides that show what is possible when someone refuses to settle for less than they deserve. And these people challenge you to grow further, not through pressure, but through partnership, accountability, and shared vision. And you begin to understand that every connection in your life should serve either growth or support. And the right people naturally fall into one of these roles. And when you enforce your standards, you notice how quickly energy vampires, manipulators, and inconsistency leave, creating room for people who elevate and inspire. And the right people amplify your strengths without diminishing yours, showing up fully, investing honestly, and contributing meaningfully to shared progress. And you start to recognize that alignment is not about similarity, but about mutual respect, shared ambition, and the willingness to meet effort with effort. And your high standards become the benchmark for the quality of relationships you will accept. And every person who meets it strengthens your life in profound ways. And you feel a sense of relief and freedom as unnecessary struggles and misaligned expectations dissolve, leaving only clarity, energy, and intentional connection. And in this space, you experience the true power of high standards, where the right people not only stay but thrive alongside you, enhancing every aspect of your journey. And the beauty of having high standards is that they naturally reveal who belongs and who doesn't, without you needing to force separation or judgment. And you notice that the right people are never intimidated. They are drawn to your energy because they respect the courage it takes to maintain boundaries and honor your values. And these individuals inspire growth, not just in themselves, but in you, because alignment is reciprocal and mutual respect fuels collective progress. And as your standards guide your choices, you find that your life becomes more intentional and every relationship begins to serve a purpose aligned with your vision. And you begin to see that fear and discomfort are often signs of misalignment, while consistency, respect, and authenticity indicate that someone belongs in your circle. And the right people show up repeatedly, not because they have to, but because they genuinely value the energy, integrity, and direction you embody, and you start to trust your intuition more deeply, knowing that your standards are a compass pointing you toward connection, opportunity, and growth that truly matter. And high standards create an environment where only people who are willing to invest in themselves and in you can thrive, resulting in relationships that are mutually empowering. And you experience the freedom of living authentically, surrounded by people who respect your growth, honor your boundaries, and mirror your ambition. And as this dynamic unfolds, you recognize that the right people don't just stay, they elevate your life, proving that standards are the ultimate attractor of quality connections. And when you live by high standards, your life becomes a magnet for alignment, and everything that does not serve your vision naturally fades away. And the right people are energized, not intimidated by your commitment to growth, and they step forward with respect, effort, and genuine investment. And you see that relationships are no longer about quantity, convenience, or approval. They are about mutual respect, shared ambition, and aligned values. And every person who remains in your circle now reflects the energy you are willing to maintain, creating a community of empowerment rather than compromise. And you realize that high standards are not limitations. They are invitations to greatness, attracting individuals who enhance, support, and inspire your journey. And the right people contribute meaningfully, celebrate authentically, and challenge productively, strengthening the trajectory of your personal and professional life. And you begin to measure success not just by achievements, but by the quality of connections you maintain, the alignment of effort, and the shared vision for growth. And high standards filter distractions and energy drains, leaving you surrounded by people who genuinely belong, who amplify your strengths, and who align with your purpose. And you understand that living by standards requires courage, consistency, and clarity, but it rewards you with freedom, empowerment, and relationships built on mutual respect. And then in this space, where the right people thrive and the wrong people fall away, you experience the transformative power of standards, witnessing how they elevate every aspect of your life.